In our reading this morning from Mark 1, we read just 10 verses, and in those 10 verses, a lot happens. And we see something of Jesus's rhythm in his ministry. That rhythm was very important for him. It was, of course, a reflection of his humanity, that need to balance priorities, to do what needs to be done, but then also to rest, which is necessary too. But Jesus was always intentional about how he used time. One of the challenges of lockdown for us, for many people, has been a loss of rhythm. Life used to almost force it upon us, didn't it? We would go out to work, we had to be somewhere at a certain time, we would have lunch maybe at the same time, we'd come home, do some things at home, meet some friends, do some hobbies, whatever it might be, get ready for sleep, and then rest. And then the next morning the cycle begins. You can substitute your own particulars in that timeline, but so often we would fall into a rhythm in life. And then the weekend comes and we can break it for a moment. But lockdown for many people has meant the loss of that rhythm, that pattern in life. And so days can begin to merge into one another, and months go by quickly, and people feel tired, even though they're mostly indoors and not very active anymore. Because we human beings need a rhythm of life. It gives us a sense of our place in the world. So I thought we might look a little bit this morning at Jesus's rhythm that is explored in this reading that we had for this morning from Mark chapter 1. So we begin with Jesus visiting the home of Simon and Andrew. They had been in the synagogue, they went to worship, and it's still Sabbath when Jesus comes to be their guest at their home. And when they get there, they discover that Simon's mother-in-law has been unwell. She has had a fever. And so naturally they bring Jesus news about this illness. And what does he do? He goes to her, he takes her by the hand and helps her up. And suddenly the fever is gone and she begins to resume normal life. The rhythm of her life resets. And it's a very understated healing story, this one. There's very little drama. All it took was a touch. But there's actually a lot more going on in this story than that very simple stating of it. I mean, firstly, Jesus is doing work on the Sabbath, something he's going to get in trouble for again and again as the story goes on. But secondly, and more importantly here, I think, Jesus moves towards this woman who is sick, and he reaches out to touch her. To touch someone who is clearly unwell is to put himself at risk. It's not clear what relationship he had with this woman, whether Jesus had met her before. But perhaps he shouldn't even be interacting with her in this way. All kinds of reasons exist in this moment for him staying at a distance. Yet he ignores all of those reasons and approaches this woman, and he brings her back to her feet. And I'd like to make a tentative connection here with our own current situation we've been living through now for almost a year. We're in the midst of a pandemic. And this pandemic is where a dangerous virus is transmitted person to person. If you remember back in the day, one of the first things that we were told to do, or rather not to do, was to shake people's hands. And we found it very hard because it's almost an impulse in us to do that. So they said, oh, instead you should bump elbows or wave or whichever way around, not actually shaking hands, or even better, just keep a safe distance and say hello. And while those things were necessary for sure, that kind of behavior change has a real consequence for us human beings. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us feel the need to connect to others physically, to shake a hand, to give a hug. Those are moments of connection, of friendship. And as I witnessed Jesus going to Simon's mother-in-law and taking her by the hand, I can't help but be moved by the compassion of Jesus in that moment. He puts himself at risk in some ways so that that moment might be a moment of healing for that woman. And while I'm not suggesting you can throw away the gloves and ignore social distancing, I think we might ask the question, how might we do the same today? How do we take people by the hand, perhaps without actually taking them by the hand? I think this time we've been living through has forced us to be creative in these ways, hasn't it? We maybe send things through the post, a little note, to be a moment of connection, even if we can't physically be present. You might have had the privilege of dropping things off to people and being able to talk on the doorstep or through a window. People have found all kinds of ways of maintaining those connections with other people. And they're important, and we should continue those. But we're hoping for a day when pandemic ends, when once again we can shake a hand or give a hug. And looking forwards, I think we might find that transition hard. Almost like changing from one rhythm to another. But I think we must be intentional about that change when the time comes, to think about it, to prepare for it, because those moments of connection might seem very simple, but for some people it might bring an immense sense of healing and connection and belonging. That simple holding of the hand. And surely it's worth our time and effort thinking about that part of our lives. So word gets around fast, people begin to bring their sick and the demon-possessed to Jesus in the hopes that he might bring healing and restoration to them. Mark tells us that he drove out many demons, but he wouldn't let them say too much. They knew who he was, but he wouldn't let them speak. And throughout Mark's Gospel, we're going to find this thread that runs, what scholars will call the messianic secret. That desire of Jesus not to be known. And it feels a little bit counterintuitive at times. Why wouldn't he want to be known for who he is? After all, if the demons speak it out and others believe them, isn't that a good thing? But again, we encounter a rhythm in Jesus' life. Jesus is living according to a schedule which isn't set by the world or by the demons, but only by God. He couldn't allow this rhythm to be disrupted by anyone else's agenda. There was work to be done. And again, I wonder about our rhythm of life, how so often we perhaps feel the pressure to work according to the pace set by others. I feel this in life generally, and I think it's generally true. I'm no longer in my early 30s, I'm aware. Society now sets expectations on the things you're supposed to do at certain points in your life. You may have experienced this going through life. You're supposed to have partners and children and jobs and homes in a certain order by a certain time. And it's a common joke, isn't it, of people living with their parents in their 20s and beyond. But all those things aren't really helpful for people. And perhaps on a more serious note, you and I are people who seek to order our lives around God's timing, not what other people suggest for us. Like Jesus, we might see something that might be a good idea. In any other situation, it might be okay to do it, but it doesn't mean it's always right for us. We must always be prepared to listen to God's timing rather than the world's timing. As we're pondering the future of our church together, as we're looking forward for what is ours to do once pandemic is lifted. We would do very well to remember this, I think, to seek to fall into rhythm with God's timings, with his patterns, with his order of things, because when we do that, we will find the blessing. Jesus knew what was his to do and what time these things should happen. And in the next phase of this very short passage, we discover that Jesus is now up early in the day, before the sun has even come up. That's how early he woke up. And he got off to a place where he could find some solitude, where he could be alone. After a while, Simon and his company come looking for him. They've discovered he's not home anymore, and they're going to have to get used to this disappearing act. Because if you read through Mark's Gospel, many times you'll see Jesus saying he's gone off to a solitary place where he could pray. Often he's alone in those moments. Other times he brings some of the disciples with him. But this rhythm of retreat is core to Jesus' life and his ministry. He knows that for him to be effective in his work, he needs to spend time in prayer with God, listening to him, resting in him, renewing his sense of calling and his identity, simply being in the presence of the Father. And that time is not empty or wasteful, but it is filled with importance and purpose. In a pandemic, when for many of us we've got lots of extra time on our hands, to say we need to stop work might seem a little bit ironic. I'd suggest, even if you are off work, if you've been furloughed, or if you're retired and you're at home, there is still much to be gained by setting aside particular moments for prayer and for quiet. Your day might well be quiet most of the time, particularly if you live alone. But there are all different kinds of quietness, aren't there? If you think about it, there is that quiet which is somehow empty and isolating and difficult for us to endure. There is sometimes a quiet which is full up of anxiety, which the world outside might be quiet, but the world inside is really noisy and hard. But then there is also that quiet which is full of the presence of God and full of his peace. And if these moments of encounter with God aren't part of the rhythm of our lives, we will soon feel the lack of it. Because Jesus was serious about taking those times away, even when there was a crowd of people waiting for him, wanting him to keep healing them and teaching them and being with them. So those moments of connection with God, of solitude, of time away, were part of Jesus's rhythm, and perhaps they should be part of ours as well. So let me offer you just a few prompting questions for you to work on for yourself. What is your rhythm during pandemic? How might you incorporate these intentional moments of solitude and prayer into your life? And I wonder, does your to-do list, those things that are left undone, often take up more of your time than they need to? Just a few questions for you to reflect on as you reflect further on this passage. And so finally, after all these things, Jesus is now ready to continue his mission in another village. It's time to move on. More people need his presence, and more people need to hear his teaching. And that is how the rhythm of our lives go as well. After rest, we begin again. We seek the people. We seek to be people who carry with us into the world the gospel, that good news of liberation and healing and hope for the future. After that time of solitude comes time of action once again. So friends, what is the rhythm of your life? Does your rhythm fall into beat with Jesus' rhythm? I want to invite you to ponder those things this week. Consider your life in lockdown and look forwards to life beyond lockdown as well. What things do you need to take up? What things do you need to leave behind? As we seek to be followers of Jesus this week, as we follow the one who had rhythm in his life, may we find ourselves more and more stepping into line, into rhythm with him. May we bring the offer of healing connection to those we meet. May we follow the schedule set by God. May we learn to take rest when it's needed, but always, always moving forwards with him, bringing with us the kingdom of God.